Welcome back to Black Box Ops, the channel that pries open the classified projects and uncovers the hidden stories behind the gear that gives our elite warriors the edge. We see the dramatic footage, the night raids, the hostage rescues, the precision strikes. We marvel at the capability, the technology, the almost science fiction-like tools wielded by America's special forces. We assume these tools are born in gleaming, multi-billion-dollar R&D facilities, the product of committees, contracts, and years of meticulous top-down design. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the most revolutionary piece of kit, the device that fundamentally changes how operators fight and survive, doesn't come from the top. It comes from the bottom. It comes from a lone wolf, a tinkerer, maybe even a perceived failure, who sees a problem no one else does and builds a solution so simple, so unorthodox, that the entire system dismisses it out of hand. Tonight, I'm telling you the story of a man who wasn't a general, wasn't a high-paid contractor, wasn't even an officer. He was a scientist, a technician, a guy whose job was just to fix things, not reinvent them. But he saw a future the brass couldn't comprehend. He saw a battlefield where a crazy wire trick could mean the difference between life and death. He built a prototype. It was mocked. It was dismissed as naive, as stupid, as a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. But that stupid prototype, it held the key. It was the seed that grew into a technology that is now utterly fundamental to how U.S. Special Forces operate, survive, and dominate in the shadows. This is how one technician's crazy wire trick made U.S. jets invisible to radar. Before we infiltrate this story, if you believe that innovation often comes from the most unexpected places and that the status quo needs to be challenged, then I need you to secure our comms channel. First, hit that subscribe button and activate the notification bell. It's your primary way to support the mission here. Second, give this video a like. It signals to the algorithms that these stories need to be declassified. And finally, drop a comment down below. Let us know what country and city you're monitoring this transmission from. Our global intelligence network is our greatest asset. All right, let's power up the prototype. His name was Dr. Elias Cade, and in 1997, he was a ghost, haunting the beige-walled, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Natick Soldier Research, Development, and Engineering Center. Cade wasn't a weapons designer. He wasn't a ballistician or an explosives expert. He was a physicist, a specialist in terahertz frequency electromagnetics, a man whose passions were humanitarian, not martial. He was, to put it mildly, an odd fit. While his colleagues were busy optimizing the ballistic protection of new helmet liners or the thermal properties of cold-weather boot insulation, Cade was obsessed with a single, deeply compassionate problem: finding life. His driving ambition, the project he poured his nights and weekends into, was Project Beacon, a device he believed could save hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives in the aftermath of terrorist bombings like the one that had just shattered Oklahoma City 2 years prior, or catastrophic earthquakes. His goal was to build a man-portable sensor, a life finder, that could penetrate dozens of feet of concrete and rebar to detect the faint, subtle biological signatures of a living human, a heartbeat, a breath. He envisioned rescue workers, soldiers in urban combat, sweeping the device over a collapsed building and seeing, in real time, survivor, 3 meters down, 2 meters left. It was a noble, almost holy quest. It was also, according to his superiors, a complete and utter waste of time. His boss, Dr. Marcus Holloway, was a man who lived and died by deliverables, by budgets, and by the strict, unambiguous requirements set forth by Army TRADOC. And TRADOC, in the late 90s, was focused on the Big Five, on Abrams tank upgrades and the Crusader artillery system. They were not interested in a high-risk, low-payoff humanitarian device that sounded like science fiction. Elias, Holloway would say, his voice a mask of forced patience. The Army is not a search and rescue organization. We have priorities. Your project has produced 0 verifiable results. The simulations are flat. The penetration is negligible. You can't even find a hamster behind a cinder block. And you're promising me you can find a man under a skyscraper? The physics just isn't there. Cade would try to argue, his hands flying as he explained his theory, that it wasn't about power, but about frequency. He believed that in the terahertz gap, that dead zone of the electromagnetic spectrum between microwaves and infrared, there existed a window, a specific set of frequencies that could penetrate dense materials without scattering, and which would be uniquely absorbed and re-radiated by the complex molecules of living tissue. He wasn't just pinging for movement, he was looking for a spectral signature. Holloway wasn't impressed. He saw only a budget line that was producing nothing. He gave Cade an ultimatum. In 1 week, at the quarterly review, he had to demonstrate a significant, undeniable breakthrough in detection capability, or Project Beacon would be terminated, its funding and lab space reallocated to a more promising program, like a new camouflage pattern. Cade was shattered, but not broken. He was desperate. He knew he was close. His simulations were flat, because the physics was too complex for the computers of the day. His real-world tests had failed, because his emitters were too weak, too diffuse. The terahertz signal was scattering off the surface of the concrete test slabs before it ever had a chance to penetrate. He needed more power, yes, but more importantly, he needed focus. He needed to get the signal into the material. His lab was a graveyard of scavenged parts, old naval radar magnetrons, signal generators from defunct university physics experiments, a custom-built emitter array that looked like a futuristic showerhead. He had one junior technician, a young, bright-eyed, terrified woman named Sarah Jenkins, who mostly just tried to keep him from accidentally electrocuting himself. For 3 days, they worked around the clock, Cade living on stale coffee and a frantic, manic energy. He was out of options. The by-the-book approach had failed. It was time for the crazy. His idea was simple: constructive interference. If he could take the output from his dozen small emitters and focus them, not just spatially, but temporally, aligning the phase of each wave perfectly, he could create a single, intense, needlepoint beam of terahertz energy. It was a phased array concept, but one so complex and precise given his mismatched, jury-rigged hardware that it was considered impossible. It required manually rewiring the entire system, bypassing every safety governor, every power limiter, every regulatory circuit that Holloway had insisted on. It was a crazy wire trick, a hardware hack that violated a dozen safety protocols. "Dr. Cade, you can't," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling as she watched him pulling the heavy shielded safety baffles off the main power supply. "The RF output, the safety limit is 5 watts. If you bypass the governors and phase align the emitters, the focal point energy will be..." "God, I can't even calculate it. You'll fry the entire array." "You could start a fire." "It's not working, Sarah," Cade shot back, his hands a blur, stripping wires, soldering new connections. "It's not working. Diffuse signal is useless. I need penetration. I need a spike. Just one clean spike. To prove the principle. To get the echo." He was a man possessed, his humanitarian goal justifying his reckless means. He was trying to save lives, and he was willing to break every rule in the lab to do it. Finally, he was done. The array was silent, but a low, ominous hum now emanated from the overloaded power supply. The air in the lab felt different, static, heavy. He pointed the array at the test target, a 3-meter-thick block of steel-reinforced concrete, the very one he'd been failing to penetrate for 6 months. Behind it, in the shielded receiving chamber, was the target, a human analog dummy, a 180-pound block of calibrated tissue-simulating ballistic gelatin, wired with temperature sensors and a single, tiny mechanical heartbeat simulator. "Okay," Cade breathed, his face slick with sweat. "Running the test, bypassing safeties, now. Emitters live, full power, focused phase, 5-second burst." He hit the enter key. The lights in the entire wing of the laboratory dimmed, the massive power draw sucking the grid dry. The emitters didn't just hum, they let out a single, low, guttural, vibrating that seemed to shake the very air in the room. A sound that felt more like a pressure than a noise. It lasted for exactly 5 seconds. Then, silence. The power supply breakers tripped, plunging the lab into emergency half-light. Cade stared at his main console. The receive screen, the one that should have shown the beautiful, faint echo of a heartbeat, was blank. Nothing. Just static. No, he whispered, his shoulders slumping. No, no, no. He had failed. He had fried the entire array, blown the breakers, violated every protocol, and still gotten no signal. It was over. Holloway was right. He was a failure. Dr. Cade? Sarah's voice was a thin, terrified squeak. Do you smell that? Cade sniffed. The familiar sharp smell of ozone from the high-voltage discharge was there, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something thick, heavy, acrid, something organic. It's like a barbecue, Sarah whispered, her face pale. A new, cold, nameless dread washed over Cade. He ran from the control room, grabbing a fire extinguisher, thinking he'd set a bundle of cables on fire. He ran down the hall to the shielded receiving chamber, the smell getting stronger with every step. He cranked the heavy, lead-lined door open. The concrete block was fine. The air in the chamber was hazy and hot. The smell was overwhelming, a sickeningly sweet roast smell. He looked at the target, the ballistic gelatin dummy. It was gone. It wasn't there. In its place, on the metal chair where it had been sitting, was a large, steaming, bubbling, carbonized black puddle. A pool of molten, smoking, liquefied goo that was dripping onto the concrete floor with a sound like frying bacon. Cade just stared. His life finder, his humanitarian rescue device, had not detected the target. It had boiled it. It had silently, invisibly, in 5 seconds, cooked it from the inside out, through 3 meters of solid, reinforced concrete. His experiment hadn't just failed, it had succeeded in the most horrifying, grotesque, and lethal way imaginable. He had accidentally built a death ray. The silence in the shielded receiving chamber was absolute, broken only by the sharp, metallic drip. Drip. Drip of the liquefied, superheated gelatin puddle striking the concrete floor. Dr. Elias Cade stood frozen in the doorway, the fire extinguisher suddenly feeling absurd, a useless toy against the thing he had just done. The air was thick, cloying, an ungodly, profane mixture of ozone, melted plastic, and the stomach-turning, sickly sweet smell of roast pork. Sarah Jenkins, his young technician, was leaning against the hallway wall behind him. Her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, a single choked, gagging sob escaping her. Cade's mind, a place of elegant physics and humanitarian dreams, was violently, utterly blank. He had just processed the result. His crazy wire trick, his desperate last-ditch phase alignment hack, had bypassed the safeties. It had focused the terahertz emitters. And it had worked. It had worked with a silent, invisible, terrifying efficiency that was 1,000 times more successful than he had ever dreamed, and 1,000,000 times more horrifying. He had set out to detect life. Instead, he had found a way to extinguish it, instantly, through 3 meters of solid steel reinforced concrete. The implications of what was now a smoking, viscous puddle on that chair began to cascade, one after another, in his paralyzed brain. This was not a rescue device. This was the perfect assassination tool, the ultimate bunker buster, a weapon that didn't explode. It just boiled. It killed the people, left the building standing. It was a war crime in a box. Dr. Cade? Sarah's voice was a terrified whisper. What is that? Cade flinched as if struck. He looked at the puddle. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had stripped the wires, the hands that had hit the key. He was Dr. Frankenstein, and that was his monster. It's a failure, Cade whispered, the lie forming on his lips even as the truth seared his mind. It's a catastrophic failure. He turned, his movement suddenly sharp, frantic. He slammed the heavy shielded door shut, locking it, as if he could wall off the horror he had just unleashed. The array, it overloaded. It must have created a resonance feedback. It cooked the gel. A freak accident. A power surge. A power surge? Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. Doctor, the power supply is fried. The lights are out, and it smells like a funeral pyre in there. That wasn't a surge. That was your beam. It worked. No! Cade snapped, his voice harsh, grabbing her by the shoulders, his eyes wild. It did not work. It failed. It failed to detect life. It failed to do anything but destroy. Do you understand me, Sarah? This experiment was a failure. A complete, total, catastrophic failure. Sarah stared at him, her fear of the experiment suddenly replaced by a new, dawning fear of her boss. She saw the panic in his eyes, the desperate need for her to agree. She just nodded mutely. Good, Cade breathed, releasing her. Now, we clean up. We vent the lab. We document the failure. We document the fried emitters, the blown breakers, the damaged target analog. We document the failure. The next 2 days were a paranoid blur. Cade and Sarah worked in a conspiracy of terrified silence. They aired out the lab, blaming the acrid smell on an electrical fire in the power supply. They disposed of the carbonized molten wreckage of the gelatin dummy, burying it in the bottom of a hazardous waste drum labeled solvent residue. Cade himself, a man who hadn't held a wrench in years, spent a full night meticulously destroying his own emitter array. He didn't just disconnect his crazy wire trick. He took a hammer and a crowbar to the custom phase aligners. He shorted out the power leads. He poured epoxy into the waveguides. He was erasing his sin. He was burying his monster, deep where no one, not Holloway, not the army, not anyone, could ever find it. He was a humanitarian. He would not be the father of a weapon that could boil a man behind a wall. He would fall on his sword. He would accept failure, publicly, humiliatingly, rather than admit the truth of his terrifying success. Then, the day of the quarterly review arrived. Cade stood in the same sterile conference room, in front of the same committee, in front of a smirking, expectant Dr. Holloway. The room was full. Holloway had clearly invited colleagues to witness the final, public execution of Project Beacon. Well, Dr. Cade, Holloway began, his voice dripping with a condescending false politeness. The week is up. Your budget is spent. Your project is at its end. The floor is yours. Please, dazzle us with your breakthrough. Did you find the hamster? The room chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Cade just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of calm, practiced defeat. He had rehearsed this. Dr. Holloway, members of the board, Cade began, his voice flat, devoid of its usual passion. I am here to report that Project Beacon is a failure. A murmur went through the room. Holloway's smirk widened. A failure, Doctor? How? Unexpected. The core hypothesis, Cade continued, his voice a monotone, that terahertz frequencies can be used for subsurface biological detection, appears to be fundamentally flawed. He clicked to a slide on the projector. It was a picture of his beautiful, custom-built emitter array. Now a mangled, scorched, and blackened wreck. In a final, desperate attempt to achieve the required penetration and signal return, I pushed the system far beyond its design specifications. I bypassed the safety governors on the power supply and phase aligners. You what? Holloway gasped, his smugness instantly replaced by genuine shock and anger. You bypassed the safeties? On a high-energy RF device? Are you insane, Cade? It was an error in judgment, sir, Cade said quietly, looking down. A catastrophic one. The result was not a breakthrough. The result was a massive, cascading overload. The emitters are fried. The phase aligners are slag. The power supply is a total loss. The entire array is gone. He clicked to the next slide, a picture of the receiving chamber. The chair was empty, the concrete wall behind it clean. Cade had scrubbed the puddle himself, bleaching the concrete until his own hands were raw, erasing the stain, the smell, and the target analog was undamaged. But the test was inconclusive. No signal was detected. Nothing. The project is a dead end. You were right, Dr. Holloway. The physics just isn't there. The room was silent, stunned. Cade hadn't just failed. He had failed spectacularly, recklessly, destroying tens of thousands of dollars in irreplaceable, custom-built government equipment in the process. He had admitted to it. He had proven himself not just a dreamer, but an incompetent, dangerous one. Holloway stood up, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. The pity was gone, replaced by the ice of a man whose authority had been vindicated in the most satisfying way possible. "Dr. Cade," he said, his voice clipping each word, "this is not just a failure. This is the most profound display of irresponsibility and insubordination I have ever witnessed at this facility. You ignored direct counsel. You violated basic safety protocols. You destroyed your own lab. And you have produced nothing." He looked around the room. "Effective immediately. Project Beacon is terminated. All associated funding is rescinded. All lab space is reallocated. And you, Dr. Cade, you are hereby reassigned, pending a full investigation into your malfeasance." The rejection was total. It was brutal. It was public. Cade didn't even get to keep his lab. His reassignment was the ultimate humiliation, a masterpiece of Holloway's bureaucratic cruelty. He was sent to the basement, to a windowless, 8x8 office in the metrology lab. His new job, his new project, was calibrating thermometers, verifying the temperature and humidity sensors for the entire facility's HVAC system. A job for a first-year intern, not a PhD physicist. He was a joke. He was the rejected scientist. The man who dreamed of finding life under rubble was now making sure the accounting office wasn't too cold. And he was alone. Sarah Jenkins, terrified for her own career, had requested, and been granted, an immediate transfer to a different division. He couldn't blame her. He was radioactive. He sat in his basement tomb, surrounded by calibration logs, the smell of dust and old paperwork, replacing the sharp scent of ozone and hot metal. He was broken. He was forgotten. But he was also a liar. Because in a locked drawer in his apartment, miles away from Natick, hidden beneath a pile of old textbooks, was a single encrypted hard drive. On it was the raw sensor data from the final, failed experiment. The power readings, the frequency logs, the thermal data from the receiving chamber. And, most importantly, his own hand-drawn, crazy schematic for the phased array emitter. The wire trick that had bypassed the safeties and focused the beam. He had failed to save lives. He had succeeded in creating a monster. And now, rejected and alone, he was the only man in the world who knew how to build it. Elias Cade's exile in the metrology lab wasn't just a professional purgatory, it was a psychological one. He spent his days in a windowless concrete box, surrounded by the quiet ticking of calibration instruments. A man whose mind was built to wrestle with the fundamental forces of the universe, now reduced to verifying that the thermostat in the cafeteria wasn't off by half a degree. The humiliation was a constant cold companion. Holloway had won, utterly and completely. He had not only killed Project Beacon, but had also buried its creator in a tomb of bureaucratic irrelevance, a place where no crazy ideas could possibly escape. Cade was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered among the other scientists. Don't be a Cade. Don't challenge the system. Stick to your deliverables. His name became synonymous with failure, a punchline for overambitious, underperforming projects. He was isolated, ostracized. Colleagues who once sought his insights on complex physics problems now averted their gaze in the hallways. afraid that associating with him might taint their own careers. Sarah Jenkins, his former technician, the only other person who knew the terrifying truth of that final experiment, was a ghost herself, transferred to a mundane logistics tracking role in a different building, a clear message from Holloway that she too was being watched. But Cade's basement tomb was also a cocoon. The crushing weight of his failure, or rather the horrifying nature of his success, was a burden he wrestled with alone, every single night. He would sit in his small apartment, the locked hard drive containing the data from that final, terrible test humming quietly in his desk drawer, a Pandora's box he was too terrified to open, yet too principled to destroy. He was a pacifist, a humanitarian, who had accidentally stumbled upon a weapon of terrifying, unprecedented power. A weapon that could cook a man through a concrete wall. A silent, invisible, perfect instrument of assassination. He wrestled with the morality of it. His first instinct, the one that led him to destroy his lab and fall on his sword, was to bury the secret forever, to let the knowledge die with him. The world was not ready for such a weapon. He was not ready to be its father. He had nightmares, not of his failure, but of his success. Nightmares of his beacon being used, not to find survivors, but to create victims. He saw his name in history books, not next to Röntgen or Curie, but next to Oppenheimer, a destroyer of worlds, and so he embraced his exile. It was a penance. Calibrating thermometers was a small price to pay for keeping a monster caged. This state of self-imposed exile, this quiet purgatory, might have lasted indefinitely. Cade might have simply faded into obscurity, a brilliant mind neutralized by his own conscience and a vengeful bureaucracy. But the world outside Natick's quiet beige walls was changing. The date was September 11th, 2001. When the towers fell, the sound of their collapse, the images of dust and ash and desperate rescue workers scrambling over a mountain of pulverized concrete, shattered Cade's isolation. He watched, mesmerized, horrified, as the reports came in, hundreds, perhaps thousands, trapped beneath the rubble. He saw the rescue crews using dogs, acoustic sensors, fiber optic cameras, fighting a desperate, losing battle against time and physics, trying to find the faint signs of life buried deep within the pile. His original project, his humanitarian dream. This was the very scenario he had dedicated his life to solving. And his device, the Life Finder, was the one thing that might have made a difference. A new kind of guilt, sharper and more immediate than the horror of his death ray, began to consume him. Had his fear, his moral paralysis, his decision to bury his work, just cost lives? He had failed to find the hamster behind the cinder block, yes, but he had successfully transmitted a beam of focused terahertz energy through 3 meters of solid, steel-reinforced concrete. He had focused on the horrifying, lethal aspect of that success. But what about the physics? He had done what everyone said was impossible. He had achieved deep, focused penetration of dense material with a terahertz wave. The lethal effect was a result of too much power, of his desperate, uncontrolled, crazy wire trick. But what if he hadn't bypassed the safeties? What if he had controlled the power? What if, instead of a 5-second high-energy blast designed to cook, he had used a series of low-power, microsecond pulses that were strong enough to penetrate, to reflect off the complex dielectric properties of a human body, but far, far too weak to cause any harm? The echo, the return signal he had failed to detect in his panicked, final experiment. It hadn't been there because his receiver was overwhelmed, blinded by the sheer raw power of his own transmission. He hadn't just cooked the target. He had cooked his sensors. The failure wasn't that the physics was wrong. The failure was that his experiment had been a clumsy, brutal, uncontrolled success. He dug the hard drive out of his drawer. He booted up the old, encrypted files. He stared at the sensor logs from that final, terrible day, the raw data from the receiver right before it fried. Amidst the saturation, the noise, the chaos. Was it? A flicker? A tiny, anomalous, structured return, just at the moment of transmission, before the sensor went blind. a reflected echo, buried in the noise floor, masked by his own overwhelming power. He couldn't be sure. It was ambiguous, a ghost in the data. But it was hope. It was the hint that his original humanitarian dream wasn't dead. The world was now at war. The war on terror had begun. The focus of the entire U.S. military establishment shifted, overnight, to a new kind of enemy. An enemy that hid, not in tanks, but in caves, in subterranean bunkers, in fortified compounds in dense urban centers, the very environments his terahertz system was designed to penetrate. The news was suddenly full of stories from Tora Bora, of U.S. Special Forces teams and airstrikes pounding a massive underground cave complex, trying to find a single man, Osama bin Laden, who was buried deep beneath tons of rock. They were using bunker-buster bombs, seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar, and finding nothing. They were blind. They were guessing. Cade watched this unfold, the irony a bitter poison. He was sitting in a basement, calibrating thermometers, while in his desk drawer sat the theoretical key to seeing through mountains. The moral calculus shifted. His fear of creating a weapon was suddenly balanced by the acute, immediate need to provide a tool that could end this, save his side, find the enemy no one else could. He started working again, in secret, at night, in his small apartment. Not on hardware, that was impossible, but on the code, on the theory. He took the raw data from his failed experiment and ran it through new, sophisticated filtering algorithms. He simulated, over and over, what a low-power pulse echo system would look like. He proved, at least to himself, that the concept was sound. The physics was right. The terahertz window did exist. He just needed to build it correctly. He needed a new sponsor. Holloway was a dead end. The man would sooner light his own career on fire than admit Cade was right. The Army, Natick, they had rejected him. So he looked elsewhere. He looked to the spooks, the intelligence agencies, the organizations with deep pockets, high-risk tolerance, and a desperate, immediate need for unconventional solutions. He looked to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the mad scientists of the Pentagon, whose entire job was to fund impossible, high-risk, high-reward ideas. He began to quietly, meticulously, prepare a new proposal. Not Project Beacon, the humanitarian life finder. This was something new, something harder. Project Echo Point, a subterranean target characterization system. Not a life finder, but a bunker mapper. It wouldn't just detect a heartbeat. It would be a true terahertz frequency, ground-penetrating radar, capable of creating a rough 3D image of what was inside a cave, behind a concrete wall, or under a collapsed building. The physics was the same. The hardware principles were the same. His phased array wire trick was the key. But the application was now purely, undeniably military. He was crossing a line, a moral event horizon he had never intended to cross. But the world had changed. The towers had fallen. His choice was no longer between doing good and doing nothing. It was between doing something and letting his fear, his rejection, render his knowledge useless in a war that was being fought in the very shadows he knew how to illuminate. He compiled his data, his new simulations, his refined algorithms, and the schematic for his crazy phased array emitter. He put it all in a new, clean, manila envelope, and this time he didn't send it to his boss. He sent it to a black mailbox, an unlisted P.O. box in Arlington, Virginia, the anonymous open-door inbox for DARPA's most unsolicited and unconventional proposals. He dropped it in the mail, and, once again, he waited. Cade's purgatory in the metrology lab lasted for 4 agonizing years. 4 years of dusting, calibrating, and logging the ambient temperature of unremarkable rooms. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered by new hires, the mad scientist who had a breakdown, fried his own lab, and got demoted to the basement. His fire, his passion, his once brilliant mind were seemingly extinguished, buried under the mundane, soul-crushing weight of his daily, meaningless tasks. He was the perfect, rejected scientist, his failure absolute, his exile complete. Dr. Holloway, now a deputy director, would sometimes pass him in the hallway, offering a thin, pitying, triumphant smile. Cade had been neutralized. He was no longer a threat to the budget, no longer a challenge to the established order. He was just the thermometer guy. But the world outside had changed. The date, September 11th, 2001, had redrawn the map of global conflict. The enemy was no longer a state, but a network. The battlefield was no longer a clearly defined front, but a shadowy, asymmetric war fought in the caves of Afghanistan and the dense urban canyons of Iraq. The United States was pouring billions into finding an enemy who hid in subterranean complexes, deep under granite and concrete, an enemy that conventional surveillance, ground-penetrating radar, and even bunker-busting bombs were failing to pinpoint. And in his basement tomb, surrounded by his ticking, precise instruments, Elias Cade watched. He watched the news reports from Tora Bora. He watched the grainy green and black footage of Special Forces teams staring helplessly at cave entrances, knowing their primary target was just yards away, but completely, totally invisible. He watched, and the slow-burning ember of his buried, terrifying secret began to glow. The failure of Project Beacon, the horrifying success of his experiment. He had buried it out of a pacifist's morality, out of a deep-seated fear of what he had created. But now, that morality was twisted, recontextualized. His death ray was a monster, yes, but the physics behind it, the penetration, that was the key. He had done what the entire multi-billion-dollar defense industry was failing to do. He had pushed a focused, coherent signal through dense material. The lethal effect, he knew, was a function of uncontrolled, catastrophic power. It was the result of his crazy wire trick, his desperate bypass of all safeties. But what if? What if he hadn't bypassed them? What if he had controlled them? What if, instead of a continuous 5-second high-energy blast designed to cook, he had used a low-power coded microsecond pulse? A signal strong enough to penetrate and reflect, but too weak to cause harm. A true echolocation system. His original humanitarian dream, but now repurposed, militarized. The moral dilemma was agonizing. To reveal his findings, he would have to admit the truth of that day, the truth of the liquefied dummy, the truth of his cover-up, the truth that he was capable of creating such a thing. But to stay silent, to hoard his secret while men were dying in a war he might hold the key to, that, he realized, was a different, colder kind of moral failure. He spent a month in the quiet of his apartment, pulling the encrypted data from his hidden hard drive. He refined the algorithms. He wrote a new proposal. Not Project Beacon, the Life Finder, but Project Echo Point, a subterranean target characterization and imaging system. He described the physics of terahertz wave penetration, the potential of a phased array emitter, his wire trick now given a respectable name, and the concept of a low-power pulse echo sensor. He carefully, deliberately, omitted the data from his final, disastrous experiment. He presented it as a theory that needed testing, not a discovery that had already been made. He signed his name, his obscure title, Metrology Technician III, stark at the bottom. He sealed it in a plain manila envelope and sent it, not to Holloway, not to the Army, but to the one place that actively solicited crazy, rejected, high-risk ideas, the Unsolicited Proposals Office at DARPA. For 6 months, nothing. The silence from DARPA was as profound as the silence from his own colleagues. His letter, he assumed, had been lost in the slush pile, a crazy idea from a failed scientist, rightfully ignored. His brief flicker of hope guttered out, leaving him in his calibrated darkness, a man resigned to his fate. Then, on a Tuesday, they came. They didn't call. They didn't email. 2 men in identical, nondescript, dark gray suits just appeared at the door of his basement office. They didn't look like military. They looked like accountants or lawyers, except for their eyes. Their eyes were cold, flat, and missed nothing. "Dr. Cade?" the taller one asked, his voice a quiet, polite monotone. Holloway wasn't even aware they were on site. They hadn't signed in. "You'll come with us." It wasn't a request. Cade was escorted, not to a conference room, not to the director's office, but out of the building, into a black unmarked sedan. They drove for an hour, in silence, to an anonymous glass and steel office park in the Virginia suburbs, a building with no name, just a number. They led him to a small windowless soundproofed room, a skiff. Seated at a simple metal table was one man. He was older, in a crisp white shirt, with the patient, weary air of a university provost. He was known, Cade would learn, only as the deputy. On the table in front of him was a single, thin, black folder. Project Echo Point, the deputy said, his voice soft. An ambitious proposal, Dr. Cade. Terahertz phased arrays, subterranean imaging, very creative. He opened the folder. In it was Cade's proposal, and underneath it, a single grainy 8x10 black and white satellite photograph. A thermal image. Cade's blood turned to ice. It was a picture of Natick, of his lab. Taken at night, 4 years ago, a massive, anomalous white-hot bloom of thermal energy was clearly visible, originating from his receiving chamber. A heat signature that had no business existing, a spike so intense it had flared the satellite's sensors. You weren't entirely truthful in your proposal, Doctor. The deputy continued, his voice still soft, conversational. You presented Echo Point as a theory. He tapped the thermal image. This suggests you are well past the theoretical stage. Cade couldn't breathe. This wasn't a job interview. It was an interrogation. They knew. It was a failure. Cade stammered, the old lie, the practiced excuse coming to his lips. A power supply overload. A fire. The deputy held up a hand, silencing him. Please, we're not Dr. Holloway. We're not the Army. We are the intelligence community. We don't care about your lab protocols. We don't care that you broke your toys, Doctor, or that you lied to your incompetent superiors. We are a results-oriented organization. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on Cade's, the kindness vanishing, replaced by a gaze of absolute chilling intensity. What we care about is this. He slid a second photo across the table, a diagram, Cade's crazy wire trick. His hand-drawn phased array schematic, the one he had destroyed, the one no one should have seen. Sarah Jenkins, the deputy said simply, answering the unspoken question. She was forthcoming, a very loyal, very frightened young woman. Cade felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just been a ghost, he'd been a suspect. So, the deputy continued, let's stop wasting time. Your proposal to build a low-power sensor is interesting, noble. We are very interested in finding things hidden in caves. He paused, his gaze hardening. But I'm far more interested in the experiment you actually conducted. The one where you generated a coherent, focused, high-energy terahertz beam and boiled a 180-pound gelatin target through 3 meters of concrete. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your failed experiment, Dr. Cade, is the single most important breakthrough in directed energy weapons this agency has seen in 50 years. You didn't just fail to build a life finder. You accidentally, brilliantly succeeded in building a death ray. Cade was shaking. No, I won't. That's not what. I'm a humanitarian. I will not build a weapon. A weapon. The deputy smiled, a cold, thin, reptilian expression. Doctor, you're thinking too small. You're thinking about boiling people. That's messy, inelegant. What we are thinking about is the signal. He tapped the satellite photo. The sheer brute force power you unleashed. You know what a high-energy terahertz pulse also does, Doctor? Besides cooked gelatin? Cade, his mind reeling, shook his head. It fries electronics, the deputy said, his voice full of discovery. It's the perfect, non-kinetic, electronic warfare pulse. It can penetrate a bunker, a tank, a ship's command and control center, and scramble every circuit, every chip, every hard drive inside. It doesn't just jam the enemy, Doctor. It lobotomizes them. Silently, invisibly, instantly. It's not a death ray. It's an off switch for their entire military. He leaned back. The war in Afghanistan, Iraq, that's just the beginning. The next war, the war with China, with Russia, will be a war of signals, of networks. The side that can turn off the other side's electronics first wins, instantly, without firing a shot. He pushed the file back towards Cade. We are going to give you a new lab, Doctor. A lab buried so deep, Dr. Holloway will never even know it exists. We are going to give you an unlimited budget. We are going to give you a team of the best minds we can find. And you are going to rebuild your crazy wire trick. You are going to perfect it. You're going to turn that failed experiment into the weapon that defines the 21st century. Cade looked at the file. He thought of his basement office, of the thermometers. He thought of his humanitarian dream, now a grotesque parody. He was trapped. His secret, his monster, was out. And the men who had found it didn't want to cage it. They wanted to weaponize it. And my sensor, Cade whispered, a last desperate plea. My echo point. Of course, the deputy smiled. You'll build that too. It's the perfect cover story for the project. And it's a good proof of concept for the low-power arrays. You'll build us the scalpel, and you'll build us the hammer. He stood up, offering his hand. You are no longer rejected, Dr. Cade. You are, as of this moment, the most valuable, most classified, and most dangerous scientist we have. Welcome to the future of warfare. This was the bargain. This was the Faustian pact, signed in a soundproofed room, witnessed by men with no names. Elias Cade, the rejected scientist, was reborn. He vanished from the Natick personnel rosters. His basement office cleared out. The official records showing a quiet, unremarkable transfer to an interagency liaison role. His colleagues, the few who even noticed his absence, assumed he'd finally been fired for his incompetence. A quiet, face-saving removal. Holloway, triumphant, likely saw it as the final, tidy disposal of an administrative problem. They had no idea that Cade had simply descended into a deeper, darker, and infinitely more powerful basement. His new lab wasn't a lab, it was a facility. A multi-level subterranean complex buried beneath an anonymous stretch of desert in Nevada, a place that didn't officially exist, funded by a black budget so deep it was lightless. His team wasn't a lone, terrified technician. It was a hand-picked roster of 20 specialists, RF engineers, pulse power experts, software developers, material scientists, all seconded from places like Los Alamos, Lincoln Labs, and the NSA. They were all brilliant, they were all ambitious, and they all understood, without it ever being said, that they were not to ask why. They were only to ask how. Cade was no longer a technician calibrating thermometers. He was the director of Project Starlight, the code name for the deputy's new venture. But it was a gilded cage. He was a prisoner of his own genius. His handlers were polite, accommodating men in suits, but they were ever present. He had unlimited resources, access to any material, any piece of test equipment he could dream of. But he couldn't leave. He couldn't make an outside phone call. Sarah Jenkins had vanished. Reassigned. The deputy had assured him with a thin smile to a non-critical post in Alaska for her own peace of mind. The message was clear. Cade was irreplaceable, and he was expendable. His only purpose was to rebuild his monster. The work was divided just as the deputy had outlined into a white project and a black one. The white project, the cover story, the one that would have the unclassified but still secret reports and budgets, was Echo Point, his original humanitarian dream. He poured his soul into it. With a real budget and a team of focused engineers, he perfected the low-power system with breathtaking speed. The crazy wire trick, his phased array emitter, was no longer a jury-rigged mess of mismatched components. It became an elegant, solid-state, digitally controlled emitter matrix, capable of steering a low-power, coded terahertz pulse with pinpoint accuracy. The receiver sensitivity was magnified 1,000-fold. In 6 months, they had a working handheld prototype. They pointed it at a concrete test bunker, a perfect replica of a Tora Bora cave entrance. And on the small high-resolution LCD screen, a ghostly 3D image appeared. Not just a blip, an image, a point cloud representation of the inside of the bunker. They could see the support beams, they could see the empty furniture, and they could see the people. A test subject, a Marine guard, walking inside the bunker. He appeared on the screen as a faint, shimmering, human-shaped cloud of returning signals, the terahertz waves interacting with the high-water content of his body. Cade had done it. His life finder was real. It could see through walls. It was the greatest breakthrough in battlefield ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, in a generation. The military liaisons who witnessed the test were speechless. This alone was worth billions. This would change urban combat forever. This was his dream, realized. But that was just the white project. That was the scalpel. The deputy was far more interested in the hammer. In a separate, even deeper lead-lined chamber of the facility, Cade was forced to work on the black project, rebuilding the high-energy weapon. His death ray. He tried to slow roll it. He cited power supply limitations, thermal management challenges, harmonic interference. But the deputy was patient, and his resources were infinite. "You built the first one in a week, Elias, with junk," he'd remind him softly. "You have the best pulse power team in the world. Solve it." Trapped, Cade had no choice. He justified it to himself, his old pacifist morality twisting into a new, pragmatic military logic. He wasn't building a lethal weapon. He was building what the deputy had called the off switch, a non-lethal, or at least less lethal tool for electronic warfare. He focused his team's efforts on frequency tuning. The cooking effect was a byproduct of a specific high-power, high-frequency resonance with water molecules. But what about other frequencies? What frequency, Cade wondered, would be perfectly, catastrophically resonant with silicon? With the microscopic, delicate PN junctions inside a microchip. He found it. A specific narrow band in the terahertz spectrum that, when hit with a high-energy focused pulse, didn't just jam a computer chip, it physically destroyed it, inducing a current so massive it melted the internal architecture, turning the CPU into a useless piece of slag, a microscopic paperweight. It was the perfect, silent, digital assassination. He built it. A larger, vehicle-mounted version of his phased array emitter, powered by a massive capacitor bank, capable of focusing a petawatt-level, picosecond duration pulse of precisely tuned terahertz energy. A pulse that could penetrate concrete, steel, earth, and kill electronics. His failed experiment was now a fully realized, terrifyingly effective weapon. Cade, the man who wanted to save lives, had just perfected the ultimate bunker buster. One that didn't destroy the bunker, but surgically lobotomized everything and everyone inside it, relying on technology. He had created the off switch for the modern world. The first field test came in 2003, during the shock and awe campaign in Iraq. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't in any press briefing. A high-priority target, a key Iraqi command and control bunker in Baghdad, had been identified. It was buried deep under a hospital, surrounded by civilians, making a conventional bomb strike impossible. A political and humanitarian nightmare. Cade was there, sitting in the back of a blacked-out mobile command center, miles away, watching a live encrypted satellite feed. He saw the target, a nondescript hospital. He saw the grainy, real-time UAV feed. Then, a non-standard asset, a modified unmanned drone carrying his hammer emitter, was moved into position. "Starlight is hot," the controller's voice said, flat, emotionless. "Target locked. Firing. Now." There was no explosion, no sound, no flash. On the satellite feed, absolutely nothing happened. The hospital was fine. The street was fine. But inside Cade's command center, a different set of screens, monitoring enemy signal traffic from that bunker, instantly went dead. Not jammed. Dead. The encrypted radio links, the high-frequency data bursts, the internet traffic. it all just stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. An entire, heavily fortified, electronically shielded command bunker had been rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. Its occupants plunged into confused, pre-technological darkness in less than a picosecond. Cade felt a wave of nausea so profound he almost blacked out. The deputy, sitting in the corner, just smiled and made a note on his pad. But it was the second deployment in 2007 in the Sadr City slum of Baghdad that cemented the true, terrifying synergy of his work. A Delta Force team was tasked with capturing a high-value Al-Qaeda bomb maker, the Engineer, who was holed up in a dense 3-story apartment complex, a labyrinth of concrete and steel rebar. The building was known to be rigged with a complex daisy chain of IEDs, all linked to a dead man switch held by the Engineer. A conventional, dynamic entry was suicide. It would be a guaranteed bloodbath, killing the team and the dozens of civilians, including the HVT's family, in the building. It was an unwinnable scenario. Cade was flown in, again, under a cloak of secrecy. This time, they brought both of his toys. Phase 1. Echo Point, the Scalpel. A 2-man Delta team, under the cover of a nearby sniper, crept onto the roof of an adjacent building. They deployed the handheld sensor. Cade, sitting in the cramped, stifling hot back of their MRAP, watched the feed on a ruggedized laptop. The grainy 3D point cloud image resolved. He saw through the walls. "Got him?" The Delta team leader whispered, his voice hushed with awe as Cade manipulated the display. "Second floor, rear apartment. I see 6 heat signatures. 4 non-combatants, 2 adult, 2 small, hostages or family, in the north room. 2 hostiles armed in the main living room. And the HVT, he's in a central closet away from the windows. He's holding something." The dead man switch. Cade's life finder was now the ultimate tactical tool. It had just painted a complete, real-time X-ray picture of the entire battlefield, eliminating all guesswork. But the problem of the IEDs remained. "Now, Doctor," the Delta team leader said, turning to Cade, his eyes hard behind his ballistic glasses. "Turn his lights off." Phase 2. Starlight, the Hammer. A second team on a rooftop 300 meters away uncased the vehicle-mounted high-energy emitter. Cade himself, his hands shaking, designated the target, feeding the precise 3D coordinates from his own Echo Point data into the weapon's targeting computer. He was aiming only for the tiny closet-sized room where the HVT was hiding. Not the room with the family, just the closet. "Target solution locked," Cade said, his voice a dry croak. "On your mark, Captain." "Execute," the captain ordered. Cade hit the key. There was no sound, no flash, just a momentary flicker of the lights inside their own MR-APE as the capacitors discharged. On Cade's Echo Point display, the heat signature of the HVT in the closet twitched, violently, then was still. The 2 other hostiles in the living room, their heat signatures, were unaffected, but the IEDs, the electronic signatures of the triggers, which the system had also been detecting, had vanished. The dead man switch was dead. The entire network was fried, lobotomized. "Starlight is effective," Cade reported, his stomach churning. "Target neutralized. IED network is inert. Go." The captain ordered. The Delta team moved, fast, silent. They blew the door, not with explosives, but with a silent hydraulic spreader, using the element of total surprise. They stormed the apartment. The 2 guards in the living room, confused, their comms dead, their night vision, which had just been fried, useless, were neutralized in seconds. The team breached the closet. The HVT was on the floor, unconscious but alive, his hand still clamped around a useless, melted piece of plastic that had been his dead man switch. The family, terrified but unharmed, was secured. Total time, from breach to all clear, 35 seconds. 0 friendly casualties, 0 civilian casualties, target captured, IED network defeated. A perfect operation, an impossible operation, made possible by his failed experiment. Cade sat in the MR app, the sound of the team's calm, professional radio chatter filling his headset. He was a hero. He had just saved the entire team. He had saved the family. He had even, in a way, saved the HVT from being blown up by his own bomb. And he felt nothing. Just a vast, cold, profound emptiness. His humanitarian dream, his life finder, had been weaponized into the most effective intelligence gathering and target isolation tool in history, and his nightmare, his death ray, had been refined into a non-lethal off switch that had just enabled a perfect, bloodless, for his side, victory. The rejected scientist, the failure in the basement, had just, in one single night, irrevocably changed modern warfare. He had made the invisible visible and the electronic vulnerable. His crazy wire trick, his bypassed safeties, his horrifying accident. It was now the billion-dollar, unacknowledged core of America's new way of war. And he, Dr. Cade, the pacifist, was its silent, forgotten, and hopelessly trapped father. The 6 months following the mailing of that manila envelope were, for Elias Cade, the purest form of psychological torture. His exile in the metrology lab continued, a monotonous, gray, soul-crushing routine of calibrating thermostats and logging humidity data. Every day, the silence from DARPA felt louder, a confirmation that his desperate final gamble had been just another failure. His proposal lost in the vast bureaucratic slush pile, just another crazy idea from a rejected scientist. The hope that had briefly flared within him guttered out, leaving behind only the cold ash of his reality. He was the thermometer guy. He was a ghost, a non-entity. He had buried his monster, and in doing so, had buried himself. Then, on a Tuesday, in the middle of a tedious sensor drift calculation for the main building's HVAC system, they came. They didn't call. They didn't email. They didn't check in at the front desk. The door to his basement office simply opened, violating the very solitude that had become his prison. 2 men in identical, nondescript, dark gray suits that seemed to absorb the weak fluorescent light. They were medium height, medium build, medium everything, utterly forgettable except for their eyes. Their eyes were cold, flat, devoid of curiosity, and they missed nothing. They scanned Cade, the cluttered desk, the calibration logs, the escape-proof concrete block walls, in a single, comprehensive sweep. "Dr. Elias Cade?" the taller one asked. His voice was a quiet, polite monotone, with no discernible accent. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Cade's heart, which had been beating at the slow, steady rhythm of his exile, gave a single, painful, lurching thump. "Yes? You'll come with us," the man said. It was not a request. Cade didn't speak. He just stood up, his lab coat, stained with calibration fluid, suddenly feeling like a clown's costume. He didn't grab his keys. He didn't turn off his computer. He just followed. They walked, in silence, out of the basement, past the security desk. The guard didn't even look up, as if the men in suits were invisible, and into the bright, cold New England sunlight. A black, unmarked sedan, a model Cade didn't recognize, was idling at the curb. No government plates, no markings at all. He got in the back. The door shut with a heavy, satisfying thud, the sound of a bank vault closing. The 2 men sat in the front. They didn't speak. They just drove. They drove for over an hour, leaving the familiar suburban sprawl of Natick, heading south, into the anonymous, glass and steel office parks of the Virginia suburbs, a landscape of identical buildings housing 10,000 secrets. They pulled into an underground garage, beneath a building with no name, just a number. They led him through a series of keycard access doors, each one hissing open and thudding shut behind them, into an elevator that went down, deep into the earth. They finally stopped in a small, windowless, soundproofed room, a SCIF, Cade recognized, a sensitive, compartmented information facility. The room was bare, save for a simple steel table and 3 chairs. Seated at the table, waiting, was one man. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a crisp white shirt and a plain dark blue tie. He had the patient, weary, intellectual air of a university provost. He looked up as Cade entered, his eyes sharp, but not unkind. "Dr. Cade," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Cade sat, his legs feeling weak, his mind a roaring void. The two men who had escorted him stood perfectly still at the door behind him. "My name is not important," the man in the white shirt said. "You can call me the deputy. I am an admirer of your work." He gestured to the single, thin black folder on the table in front of him. Project Echo Point, an ambitious proposal, terahertz phased arrays, subterranean imaging. Very creative, very bold. For a metrology technician, the three. Cade's blood turned to ice. This wasn't an interview. It was an interrogation. They knew. It's a theoretical proposal, Cade stammered, the old familiar shame washing over him. "Based on some data I collected a few years ago." "Yes," the deputy said, his voice still soft. "Your data." "We found your proposal intriguing, Dr. Cade, so we did our own due diligence. We acquired certain relevant sensor data from the time of your previous project, the Project Beacon failure." He opened the folder. In it was Cade's proposal, and underneath it, a single grainy 8x10 black and white satellite photograph, a thermal image. Cade's heart stopped. It was a picture of Natick, of his lab. Taken at night 4 years ago, a massive, anomalous, white-hot bloom of thermal energy was clearly visible, originating from his receiving chamber. A heat signature that had no business existing, a spike so intense it had flared the satellite's sensors. "You weren't entirely truthful in your proposal, Doctor," the deputy continued, his voice still gentle, conversational. "You presented Echo Point as a theory, a low-power sensor concept." He tapped the thermal image. "This suggests you are well past the theoretical stage. This suggests you generated a phenomenal amount of focused energy, far, far more than any life finder would ever require. It also suggests, Doctor, that you lied, not just to us, but quite thoroughly to Dr. Holloway and the entire U.S. Army." Cade couldn't breathe. He was exposed, utterly. It was a failure, Cade whispered, the old lie, the practiced excuse coming to his lips automatically. "A power supply overload, a catastrophic failure, an electrical fire." The deputy held up a hand, silencing him. "Please, Elias. May I call you Elias?" Cade just nodded dumbly. "Please," the deputy said. "We're not Dr. Holloway. We're not the Army. We are the intelligence community. We don't care about your lab protocols. We don't care that you broke your toys, Doctor, or that you lied to your incompetent superiors. We are a results-oriented organization." He leaned forward, his eyes locking on Cade's, the kindness vanishing, replaced by a gaze of absolute chill.